She didn't raise her voice, and somehow, that made the whole room feel louder. The restaurant had been full just seconds before. The low hum of conversations, silverware tapping against plates, the faint scent of grilled steak and butter hanging in the air. But now everything felt suspended, like someone had pressed pause on the entire space. Every eye drawn toward a small figure near the center aisle. An elderly black woman standing still beside a table, her posture straight despite the slight tremble in her hands. Her glasses sitting just a little off-center as if the moment had shifted more than just the room around her. A glass lay shattered at her feet, ice melting slowly across the polished floor, water creeping outward in thin reflective lines, and across from her stood a younger man, sharply dressed, confident in a way that filled space without asking, his expression impatient, dismissive, like this interruption was nothing more than an inconvenience in his day. A few people glanced down at their plates. Others pretended to check their phones. The staff hovered near the edges, uncertain, waiting for someone else to act first. But no one did. Not yet. The woman inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that came from years of learning when to speak and when to simply endure. She bent carefully, knees stiff with age, and reached for the largest shard of glass, her fingers pausing just above it as if measuring the moment, not the object. Then she picked it up gently, placing it on a napkin she had pulled from the table, one piece at a time. Deliberate, patient, her coat, a faded blue that had seen more winters than most people in the room, shifted softly with her movement, catching the warm overhead light. The man let out a quiet scoff, not loud enough to echo, but enough to be heard. "You should be more careful," he said, his tone casual, almost bored, as if the entire situation existed solely because of her. The words hung there, heavier than they should have been, and still she didn't respond, not immediately. Instead she finished gathering the broken pieces, placing them neatly together like something that could still be made whole if handled with enough care. Then she straightened, slowly, her back aligning again, her chin lifting just enough to meet his gaze without challenge, without fear, just presence, the kind that doesn't demand attention but earns it anyway. For a second, just one, the room seemed to shift again, like something unspoken had passed through it, subtle but undeniable. A waiter took a half step forward, then stopped. Another guest leaned slightly closer, watching now instead of pretending not to, and the woman finally spoke, her voice soft, steady, carrying farther than anyone expected. "Everyone deserves a little patience," she said, not accusing, not defensive, just true. The man's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, then relaxed again into that same dismissive calm. But something had already changed, not in him, not yet, but in the space between them, in the way the room no longer felt comfortable looking away, in the way silence now pressed heavier than noise. And somewhere near the entrance, just beyond the glass doors, a shadow passed across the floor, unnoticed by most, but enough to make one of the staff members suddenly straighten, their posture shifting like they had just remembered something important, something that was about to matter more than anything happening in this moment. And the woman, still standing there, hands now still at her sides, didn't turn, didn't react, but her fingers, just barely, stopped trembling. The woman's name was Evelyn Carter, and there was a reason her voice never rushed, a reason her movements carried that quiet precision that made even small gestures feel intentional. She had lived 72 years learning that dignity was not something given by a room. It was something you carried into it. No matter how people looked at you or chose not to, she had arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes earlier, just as she always did every Sunday afternoon, requesting the same booth near the window where the late daylight filtered through the glass and rested softly on the table. She had ordered the same tea, warm, simple, nothing extravagant, because for her it was never about the food. It was about the moment, the pause in a week filled with memories, responsibilities, and quiet routines that no one else ever noticed. The staff knew her by face if not by name, a few of them nodding politely when she entered, one young hostess offering a small smile that Evelyn returned with gentle warmth. She always tipped in cash, always folded neatly, always with a soft "thank you" that lingered longer than most words spoken in that place. Across the room conversations had returned in fragments, but not fully, not yet. People were still watching without appearing to watch, still listening without admitting it, Because something about Evelyn made it difficult to completely look away, the man across from her shifted his weight, adjusting his jacket as if trying to reset the moment back into something he could control, something smaller, less visible. But the room had already changed shape around them, and even he could feel it, even if he would never admit it. Evelyn reached for her napkin and gently dried her fingertips, the small tremor still there but softer now, almost like it belonged to a different time, a different version of her. She glanced briefly toward the window, not to escape, but to center herself, to remind her body that she was still here, still grounded, still steady. Outside, a car passed slowly, sunlight reflecting off its surface and sending a brief flicker of light across the glass. It landed on her face for just a second, illuminating the fine lines around her eyes, the kind that came not from worry, but from years of seeing, understanding, enduring. When she turned back, her gaze did not settle on the man, but slightly beyond him, as if she saw more than just what stood in front of her. And that was what made him uncomfortable, more than her silence, more than her calm. It was the feeling that she was not reacting the way he expected, not fitting into the role he had already decided for her. One of the servers took another hesitant step forward, tray in hand, then paused again, caught between instinct and uncertainty, because stepping in meant choosing a side, and most people in that room were not ready to do that. Not yet. Evelyn placed the folded napkin back on the table, aligning it carefully beside her untouched cup of tea. The steam had faded now, leaving only a faint warmth rising from the surface. She rested her hand lightly against the edge of the table, fingers relaxed, posture unchanged, and for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath again, not because of what had happened, but because of what had not happened. No anger, no raised voice, no collapse, just a quiet refusal to be diminished. And near the entrance, that same staff member who had straightened earlier now stood fully alert, eyes fixed toward the door, as if waiting for something or someone. And though Evelyn did not turn to look, something in her expression softened just slightly, almost imperceptible, like she already knew that whatever came next would not need to be forced, it would simply arrive. The man's name was Jason Whitmore, and everything about him was designed to be noticed, from the sharp cut of his charcoal suit to the polished shine of his shoes that had likely never touched anything less than pristine pavement. He stood there now with a kind of restless confidence, the kind that came from years of never being questioned, never being told to wait, never being asked to consider anyone else in the room. His watch caught the overhead light as he adjusted his cuff, a subtle movement, but deliberate, like a reminder to himself and everyone watching that his time, his presence, mattered more than whatever inconvenience had just occurred. He glanced around briefly, expecting the room to follow his lead, to return to normal, to forget, but the energy had shifted in a way he could not quite control, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. "Look, it was an accident," he said, his voice measured now, not loud, but firm, as if rewriting the narrative in real time, reframing the moment into something smaller, something forgettable. A few people nodded faintly, not because they agreed, but because it was easier than resisting, easier than stepping into something uncomfortable. The manager stood a few feet away, hands clasped tightly in front of him, eyes flickering between Jason and Evelyn, calculating, hesitating, because Jason looked like the kind of customer who left large tips, the kind who came with influence, the kind who could make a complaint that traveled farther than a quiet apology ever would. And that mattered in places like this, more than it should. Evelyn remained still, her presence no longer fragile, but anchored, as if the ground beneath her feet belonged to her in a way that no one else in the room fully understood. Jason shifted again, a slight edge creeping into his expression now, the faintest sign that the situation was not resolving as quickly as he expected. "You are making this into something it does not need to be," he added, his tone cooler, less patient, but still controlled, always controlled, because control was how he maintained his position, how he ensured the world responded to him the way it always had, without resistance, without reflection. Across the room, a couple exchanged glances, one of them lowering their voice as if speaking too loudly might draw attention. Another diner paused mid-bite, fork hovering in the air, forgotten. The clink of dishes from the kitchen faded into the background, replaced by something heavier, something quieter, a kind of collective awareness that this moment had not yet reached its end. Evelyn finally looked directly at Jason, not with anger, not with challenge, but with a clarity that made his words feel smaller the moment they left his mouth. Her gaze steady, unhurried, as if she had seen this kind of confidence before, in different faces, in different places, over decades that had taught her how quickly it could dissolve when confronted with something real, something grounded. She did not speak again, not yet, because she did not need to. The silence between them had already begun to shift its weight, no longer protecting him, no longer excusing him, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, holding him there, in full view of a room that was no longer looking away. And near the entrance, the glass doors reflected a figure now fully formed. No longer just a passing shadow, the staff member who had been watching straightened completely, stepping slightly forward with a quiet urgency that did not go unnoticed. Jason followed the movement. Instinctively, his eyes flicking toward the door for the first time. Just a brief glance, but enough to register that something, or someone, had entered the space with a presence different from his own, something quieter, but far more certain, and for the first time since the moment began, the confidence in his posture shifted, just slightly, almost invisible, but real. The door closed softly behind him, but the sound carried farther than it should have, not because it was loud, but because everything else had gone so still that even the smallest shift in the room felt amplified. The man who entered did not rush, did not announce himself. He simply stepped forward with a calm, measured pace that made space without asking for it. His suit was tailored but understated, dark navy, perfectly fitted, the kind of presence that did not rely on noise to command attention. A few staff members straightened instinctively, one of them lowering their heads slightly in acknowledgement, not dramatic, not obvious, but practiced, respectful, the kind of reaction that came from knowing exactly who had just walked in. Jason noticed it now, really noticed it. The way the manager's posture changed, the way the server who had hesitated earlier now moved with quiet urgency toward the entrance, as if trying to intercept something already in motion. "Good afternoon, sir," the manager said, voice suddenly more certain, more careful, but the man barely nodded, his attention already shifting past him, scanning the room not with curiosity, but with recognition, like he already knew what he was looking for before he even saw it. His eyes moved across the tables, past the flicker of nervous glances, past the half-finished meals and frozen conversations, until they stopped, completely, on Evelyn. And in that instant, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from a distance, but enough that the people closest to him felt it, a tightening, a focus, a quiet gravity settling into place. He took another step forward, slower now, more deliberate, and the distance between him and the center of the room seemed to shrink faster than it should have, as if the space itself was giving way. Evelyn did not turn immediately. She did not react the way most people would when someone new entered a charged moment. Instead, she remained exactly as she was, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, as if she had been waiting, not for rescue, not for intervention, but for something inevitable to arrive in its own time. Jason shifted again, this time more noticeably, his confidence no longer expanding to fill the room, but adjusting, recalibrating, his eyes flicking between the man approaching and the staff who suddenly seemed more attentive, more aligned. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice even, controlled, not raised, but clear enough to carry across the silence. It was not a question asked out of curiosity. It was a question that expected truth, the kind that did not leave much room for deflection. The manager opened his mouth, then paused, caught between two realities, one he had been navigating moments ago, and one that had just entered the room. Jason stepped slightly forward, instinctively placing himself back into the center of the situation. "It has been handled," he said, quick, composed, almost rehearsed, but the words did not land the same way they would have just minutes earlier. The man's gaze did not shift to him. Not yet. It remained on Evelyn, steady, searching, as if confirming something beyond what was visible. And then, finally, Evelyn turned her head, just enough to meet his eyes. And for the first time since he entered, the man's composure cracked, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone could call dramatic, but in the smallest, most human way, a flicker of recognition, a softening that replaced the sharp focus, and in a voice that was quieter than before, but somehow carried even more weight, he spoke again. "Mom, are you all right?" The word landed in the room like something heavier than sound, not loud, not sharp, but undeniable. Mom. And for a moment no one moved. Not the manager, not the servers, not even Jason, whose expression shifted in a way he could not fully control, his posture tightening as if the ground beneath him had just become unfamiliar. The man stepped closer now, his attention no longer scanning, no longer assessing, but focused entirely on Evelyn, the distance between them closing with quiet certainty. "Are you all right?" he asked again, softer this time, and Evelyn gave the smallest nod, her lips pressing together gently, not in distress, but in reassurance, as if she were the one calming him instead of the other way around. "I am fine," she said, her voice steady, unchanged, and that steadiness seemed to settle something in him, but only slightly, because his eyes had already begun to take in the details around her. The broken glass carefully gathered on the napkin, the untouched tea, the tension still hanging in the air like something unresolved. He turned then, slowly, his gaze moving across the room with a different kind of awareness now, one that did not ask permission to see, one that did not ignore what others chose to overlook. The manager straightened further under that look, his hands clasping tighter, his voice caught somewhere between explanation and apology that had not yet been spoken. Jason shifted again, this time stepping forward as if to reclaim control of the situation before it moved too far beyond him. "There is no issue," he said quickly, his tone confident but thinner now, stretched. "It was just a misunderstanding." The words came out clean, practiced, but they did not settle the room the way he intended, because the man did not respond immediately. He simply looked at him, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that felt far more dangerous than either, a calm that suggested he was not deciding what had happened, but whether it mattered, and to what extent. Jason held that gaze for a second longer than he meant to, then adjusted his stance, his hand brushing lightly against his sleeve, a habit of control, of composure, but the movement felt smaller now, less certain. "We have already handled it," he added, reinforcing his position, reinforcing the version of events he wanted to exist, but the room had already begun to lean in another direction, drawn not by volume, but by presence, by the quiet authority standing just a few feet away from him. The man's eyes returned to Evelyn briefly, checking again, confirming something unspoken, and then back to Jason, his voice even, measured, but carrying a weight that pressed against every corner of the room. "Handled?" he repeated, not as a challenge, but as a question that required an honest answer, one that could not be shaped as easily as before. The manager took a small step forward then, unable to remain silent any longer. "Sir, we were just about to resolve," but the words trailed off, unfinished, because he did not know which truth to speak, the one he had allowed moments ago, or the one that was now expected, and in that hesitation, everything became clear without needing to be said. Jason exhaled quietly, his jaw tightening just slightly, the first visible crack in his confidence, as if he could feel the shift happening around him but could not quite stop it. And Evelyn, still standing there between them, placed her hand gently against the table once more, grounding herself in the moment, her gaze calm, her presence unchanged, as if none of this was about power, not to her, not in the way the room was beginning to understand it, and the man beside her, still composed, still quiet, finally spoke again, not louder, not harsher, but with a clarity that left no room for anything else. "Tell me exactly what happened." The question did not echo, but it settled into the room with a weight that made silence feel like an answer no one wanted to give. The manager swallowed, his throat tightening as every pair of eyes seemed to shift toward him at once, waiting, expecting, and for the first time since this moment began, he could no longer rely on routine, on policy, on the quiet compromise that usually kept things moving. "Sir, it was a small incident," he began, his voice careful, measured, but uncertain, the kind of uncertainty that revealed more than confidence ever could. His gaze flickered briefly toward Jason, then back again, as if searching for a version of the truth that would satisfy both sides. But there was no version like that left. Not anymore. Evelyn remained still, her presence unchanged, her hand resting lightly against the table, her breathing slow and even, as if she had stepped outside the tension entirely, observing it rather than being consumed by it. Jason let out a short breath through his nose, the sound almost inaudible, but enough to signal his impatience. "There is nothing to explain," he said, stepping in before the manager could continue, his tone sharper now, less composed, the edges of control beginning to fray. "It was an accident, and it has already been addressed," he added, emphasizing each word as if repetition alone could restore the balance he had lost. But the man did not respond immediately. He simply watched him, and in that pause, something shifted again, the room no longer waiting for resolution, but for truth, the kind that could not be redirected or softened. One of the servers, the same young woman who had smiled at Evelyn earlier, took a small step forward, her hands trembling slightly as she held her notepad close to her chest. She hesitated, just for a second, then spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Sir," she did not cause it. The words were simple, but they landed with a clarity that cut through everything else. Jason turned toward her quickly, surprise flashing across his face, followed by something colder, something defensive. "You need to be careful with what you are implying," he said, his voice low, controlled again, but tighter now, the kind of control that comes from pressure, not confidence. The server's eyes flickered, but she did not step back, not this time. "I saw what happened," she added, her voice steadier now, anchored by the truth she had chosen to speak. The manager shifted beside her, tension pulling at his posture, but he did not interrupt, because the moment had already moved beyond his control. The man's gaze shifted to the server, his expression unchanged, but attentive, absorbing every word without interruption. "She was just sitting," the server continued, her voice gaining strength with each sentence, "and the glass, it was knocked over from the other side." She did not look directly at Jason as she said it, but she did not need to. The implication was clear. The room responded in silence, but it was no longer passive, it was charged, aware, as if every person present had just been given permission to see what they had avoided before. Jason's jaw tightened, his shoulders squaring as if preparing to push back, to reclaim the narrative. But the space around him had changed too much, the weight of attention no longer supporting him, but pressing in from all sides. Evelyn finally moved, just slightly, lifting her hand from the table and placing it gently over the folded napkin, her fingers resting on the edge of the glass pieces she had already gathered, not as a shield, not as a defense, but as a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had just been said without needing to add anything more. And beside her, the man took a slow breath, his expression still composed, but his eyes now carrying something deeper, something resolved, as if the truth had settled into place and there was no longer any need to question it, only to decide what would come next. The room did not erupt, it did not shift with noise or sudden movement. Instead, it settled into something far more powerful, a quiet understanding that could no longer be undone. The man stood there for a moment after the server finished speaking, his gaze steady, absorbing the final pieces of truth without hesitation, without doubt. Then he nodded once, a small motion, but final, as if something inside him had just aligned completely. His attention moved back to Jason, not rushed, not aggressive, just certain, and that certainty carried more weight than anything said before. "So it was not an accident," he said, his voice calm, level, but now unmistakably firm, the kind of firmness that does not argue. "It concludes." Jason's expression tightened, his confidence no longer fluid, now forced into place like something held together under pressure. "That is not what was said," he replied quickly, but the words felt thinner now, less convincing even to himself, because the room had already heard the truth, had already accepted it, and there was no longer space for reinterpretation. The man took another step forward, closing the distance just enough that the difference in presence became undeniable, not in size, not in volume, but in gravity, in the way the air itself seemed to respond to him. "I heard exactly what was said," he continued, his tone unchanged, but now carrying a quiet authority that no one in the room questioned. The manager lowered his gaze slightly. The server stood still, her shoulders no longer trembling, and even the background noise from the kitchen had faded into something distant, irrelevant. Jason shifted his stance again. But this time there was no smooth recovery, no practiced ease, only a subtle hesitation. That revealed more than any words could. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be," he said, his voice lower now, less certain, almost searching for support that was no longer there. But the man did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes moved briefly to Evelyn, still standing with the same quiet composure, her hand resting over the folded napkin, her presence unchanged. And in that glance there was something deeper than concern, something rooted, something that had been there long before this moment and would remain long after it. When he looked back at Jason, there was no anger in his expression, only clarity. "No," he said simply, and that single word settled heavier than anything else spoken so far. "It is exactly as big as it needs to be." The statement did not rise in volume, but it expanded in meaning, filling the space with a truth that no one could step around. Jason's jaw tightened again, his eyes flicking briefly toward the manager, then the server, then back, as if searching for an exit that had quietly disappeared. And for the first time since the moment began, he did not immediately speak. He paused, just long enough for the silence to shift fully away from him, to leave him exposed in a way he had never expected, and the man, standing just a few feet away, let that silence settle, not rushing to fill it, not forcing the next step, because he did not need to. The truth had already done that for him. The room felt different now, not tense, not frozen, but aware, every person present no longer watching out of curiosity, but out of understanding, witnessing something that was no longer about a single moment, but about what that moment revealed. And Evelyn, still at the center of it all, remained exactly as she had been, calm, grounded, untouched by the shift in power unfolding around her, as if she had known all along that it would not come from force, but from something far quieter, something far stronger. Jason's silence stretched longer than he expected, longer than he could comfortably hold. And for the first time, it was not the room waiting on him. It was him standing inside a moment he could not control, his shoulders squared again. But the motion felt rehearsed now, delayed, like he was trying to return to a version of himself that had already slipped away. "I think this has gone far enough," he said finally, his voice measured, but lacking the sharp certainty it once carried. He reached for his jacket as if preparing to leave, as if distance alone could resolve what had already unfolded. But the man did not move aside, did not block him, simply remained where he stood, calm, grounded, his presence enough to pause the motion before it fully began. "It has," he replied quietly, not as agreement, but as completion, as if something had already reached its natural end, and now only the response remained. Jason's hand lingered on his sleeve for a moment, then dropped, the small hesitation enough to reveal the shift he could no longer hide. The manager took a cautious step forward, sensing that the moment was changing direction again, but unsure how to follow it. "Sir, we can offer a complimentary," he began, defaulting to policy, to resolution through transaction, but the man raised his hand slightly, not abrupt, not dismissive, just enough to stop the words before they formed fully, because this was not something that could be balanced with a gesture, not something that could be corrected with a line on a receipt. His attention moved once more to Jason, steady, unbroken. "This is not about compensation," he said, his voice even, controlled, but carrying something deeper now, something that extended beyond the room, beyond the moment. Jason exhaled again, slower this time, his posture no longer expanding, but settling, as if the weight of the situation had finally found its place. His eyes dropped, briefly, not in surrender, but in recognition, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to argue, nothing left to reframe. And when he looked up again, there was a flicker of something unfamiliar in his expression, not anger, not defiance, but uncertainty, the kind that does not know where to stand. Evelyn watched him quietly, her gaze unchanged, her presence neither judging nor forgiving, simply present. And that presence seemed to hold more power than anything else in the room, because it did not demand anything. It did not push, it simply existed. And that made everything else feel smaller in comparison. Jason opened his mouth as if to speak, then paused, the words not forming as easily as before, the silence returning. But this time it was not heavy, not oppressive. It was clear, almost reflective, giving space for something different to emerge. The man beside Evelyn remained still, his attention no longer searching, no longer questioning, because the truth had already done its work. Now it was a matter of what came after. And in that stillness, Jason finally spoke, not loudly, not confidently, but carefully, each word chosen instead of assumed. "I may have misread the situation," he said, the sentence incomplete in its meaning, but complete in its shift. The room did not react with sound, but with something quieter, a subtle release. As if everyone present had been holding something they could now let go of. The manager lowered his gaze. The server exhaled softly, and Evelyn, after a brief pause, gave the smallest nod, not as acceptance, not as closure, but as acknowledgement. And in that moment, the power in the room did not belong to the man who had entered, nor the one who had spoken. It rested quietly with her, in the way she chose to stand, in the way she chose to remain exactly who she was, unchanged by everything that had tried to diminish her. And that was something no one there would forget. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because the moment did not need more words. It had already said everything it needed to. The air in the restaurant felt different now, lighter, but not in a way that erased what had happened. It carried it, acknowledged it, and then allowed it to settle into something understood. Jason stood still for a second longer, his posture no longer rigid, no longer reaching outward, but pulled inward slightly, as if he was finally standing without the expectation of being followed. He adjusted his jacket again, slower this time, not as a statement, but as a habit, something to do with his hands while the room no longer responded the way it once had. He gave a small nod, not directed at anyone in particular, and then stepped back, not rushed, not forced, just a quiet exit from a space that no longer held him the same way. No one stopped him, no one needed to. The moment had already done what it came to do. The manager exhaled softly, a breath he had been holding without realizing, and began to move again, signaling to the staff with subtle gestures that service could continue, that the room could return to its rhythm. But even as plates were adjusted and conversations slowly resumed, something had changed, something that would not disappear with time or routine. Evelyn remained by the table, her hand still resting lightly over the folded napkin. The glass pieces beneath it no longer sharp, no longer scattered, just contained. Like the moment itself, she looked down briefly, then lifted the napkin and set it gently aside, her movements calm, deliberate, unchanged, as if she were simply continuing a quiet routine that had never been interrupted. The man beside her watched for a second, then reached out, not to take control, not to guide, but simply to be present, his hand resting lightly near hers on the edge of the table, not touching, but close enough to be felt. "Let me get you another tea," he said softly, his voice no longer carrying authority, but something warmer, something familiar. Evelyn glanced at him, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips, subtle, but real. "That would be nice," she replied, her voice just as steady as before. The server stepped forward, quickly now, her earlier hesitation replaced with quiet confidence. "Right away," she said, her tone respectful, but no longer uncertain, as if she had found something in herself that would remain long. After this shift ended, the sunlight outside had moved slightly, casting a different angle through the window, catching the edge of Evelyn's coat and the polished surface of the table. The reflection softer now, less fractured. The room continued to move, but not in the same way. There was a gentleness in it, a quiet awareness that lingered in the background, shaping the way people looked at one another, the way they spoke, the way they paused before acting. And as Evelyn sat back down, her posture relaxed, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of completion. The man took the seat across from her, not as a figure of authority, but as a son returning to a simple moment. And for a while, nothing more was said. No explanations, no reflections, just the soft clink of a new cup being placed on the table, the faint rise of steam, and the quiet understanding that sometimes The strongest thing a person can do is remain exactly who they are, even when the world around them tries to change it. And in that stillness, justice did not announce itself. It simply existed, steady, undeniable, and complete.